Thank you for joining us at this hour. I'm Daniel Che in Seoul, here to give you the latest. President Park Geun-hye has tapped current Defense Minister Kim Kwan-jin as her new top security advisor. Referring to Kim's 4-year tenure as defense chief, the presidential office said the nominee's field experience and years of policymaking will help him faithfully carry out duties as the head of the National Security Office. The former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Min-koo, whose confidence within the military was highly noted, has been nominated to replace Kim. Sunday's nomination comes 10 days after both the president's top security advisor and the intelligence chief stepped down amid government reforms. President Park is thought to have named a candidate for one of the two posts amid rising concerns about a prolonged vacancy in the security control tower and continuous threats from North Korea. Seoul urged Pyongyang on Sunday to release a South Korean missionary who has been sentenced to hard labor for life by the North. In a statement, South Korea's Unification Ministry said it was extremely regrettable the North has ignored the South's calls to free South Korean detainee Kim Jong-uk and instead put him on trial. North Korea's state media said Saturday that the missionary had admitted to committing religious acts against the state. Kim was arrested by the North last October on charges of espionage and trying to set up underground churches. The Unification Ministry said North Korea's latest measures are a serious violation of human rights and asked that Kim be allowed contact with his family and lawyer until he is freed. The defense chiefs from Korea and U.S. have agreed to set the timing and conditions for the transfer of wartime operational control from Washington to Seoul by October. Experts are predicting the transfer date will be sometime in early 2020. Our Kim Hyun-bin reports.
The transfer of wartime operational control from Washington to Seoul topped the agenda of talks between Korean Defense Minister Kim Kwan-jin and U.S. Secretary of Defense Chuck Hagel at the ongoing Asia Security Summit, Shangri-La Dialogue, in Singapore over the weekend.
Korea and the U.S. have agreed to set the date and conditions for the transfer by the annual Security Consultative Meeting in October. We have been conducting numerous working-level talks and are scheduled to hold several more rounds of talks.
Experts say the transfer is likely to be pushed back 5 to 7 years and will take place in early 2020. That's the time when Korea Air and Missile Defense System, which could counter missiles and nuclear weapons from Pyongyang, is scheduled to be implemented. The question of whether the U.S.-led missile defense system will be implemented in Korea was not discussed during the meeting. Korea's defense ministry says there were no opposing views on Korea setting up its own missile defense system.
As we've said in the past, we will establish our own missile defense system while enhancing interoperability with the U.S. Japan will not be included in our plan.
In related news, Kim said that Japan could exercise its collective self-defense outside the theater of South Korea's operations, a thinly veiled warning that Japanese self-defense forces will not be admitted to South Korea unless requested by Seoul. Kim Hyun-bin, Arirang News.
Hwang Jun-guk, South Korea's chief negotiator to the six-party talks, left for Washington earlier this Sunday for discussions with his American counterpart Glenn Davies. The two will meet Monday for talks on the coordination of efforts to denuclearize North Korea and the handling of Pyongyang's nuclear programs in the future. The six-nation talks involving the two Koreas, the U.S., China, Japan, and Russia, have been stalled since late 2008. The two negotiators will also discuss a recent deal between North Korea and Japan involving the release of Japanese nationals abducted by Pyongyang. Tokyo said it would lift some sanctions on Pyongyang and provide humanitarian aid, a move that could hinder concerted efforts to bring the reclusive regime back to the nuclear negotiating table. President Park Geun-hye attended a prayer service on this Sunday where she consoled the families of victims of the recent Sewol ferry accident and prayed for the return of the 16 that are still missing. During the service, those in attendance offered prayers for the residents of Ansan, where many of the ferry passengers were from, and for Korea to recover from the disaster. The Korean churches hosting the service released a letter in which they pledged to help the country overcome its grief and build a safer and happier nation based on principles and righteousness. President Park thanked the churches for their volunteer work, fundraising efforts, and prayer following the Seoul accident. Korea's rival political parties have weighed in on the result of 2 days of early voting for local elections on June 4th. After the National Election Commission released the details earlier this Sunday, the focus was on how many people from which age group took part. Our Kwon-jin has more.
After a whopping 11.5% of Korea's eligible voters cast ballots during 2 days of early voting for the upcoming local elections, attention now is focused on which age groups had the best turnout. Voter turnout was the highest at nearly 16% among the youngest voting group, who usually tend to be progressive. They were followed by those in their 60s at 12%, who tend to lean conservative. Turnout was lower among voters in their 30s and 40s. The turnout was similar for voters in their 20s and 30s combined and for those in their 50s and above. Neither the ruling nor main opposition party seemed to be satisfied with the figures.
It's hard to tell which party will benefit the most from the early voting turnout. A narrow-minded analysis by politicians could lead voters to misjudge the situation.
However, the ruling Saenuri party did express its concerns about the high voter turnout among young people, while the main opposition New Politics Alliance for Democracy said the number isn't actually that high, considering that the majority of the country's 35,000 soldiers are part of the 16% of people who voted in advance.
Overall, the voter turnout among those in their 30s and 40s is low. We're keeping an eye on that, as a percentage is 2.5% to 3% lower than that of those in their 50s and 60s.
Experts say the party's official statements on the early voting turnout seem like a typical strategy to boost support in the days before an election. Kwon-jin, Arirang News.
In other news, Korea posted a trade surplus for the 28th straight month in May on the back of economic recoveries in the U.S. and Europe. The Ministry of Trade, Industry and Energy said Sunday Korea's exports amounted to $47.9 billion in May, a drop of 0.9% from the same month a year ago, while imports came to $42.5 billion, a rise of 0.3 percentage points from the previous year. That translates to a trade surplus of $5.35 billion. The ministry attributed the decline in exports to a cut in the number of working days in May due to a row of public holidays. Exports to the U.S. and Europe have increased over the past year, while those to China and Japan are shrinking. The Korean government is seeking to ramp up efforts to implement a creative economy in the space industry. It plans to use satellite information to tackle social problems and come up with measures to protect citizens and national assets from space threats. For more, here's our Paul Yi.
The Korean government is looking to the stars with a new set of advanced space policies. The Ministry of Science, ICT, and Future Planning agreed to implement 2 plans regarding the use of satellite information and preparations for space threats at the 7th National Space Committee, a deliberative body for space development. Science Minister Kim Kwan-jin said the plans are part of efforts to implement a creative economy in the space industry and protect national security and space assets. The government plans to establish a special organization that will oversee the management and use of satellite information by 2015. As part of its Satellite Information 3.0 campaign, the government is also seeking to establish a one-stop platform where the public will be able to search for satellite information. The platform is also expected to create new businesses and public services. As for space threats, which include space objects falling to Earth and collisions between satellites and space wreckage, the ministry noted that Korea lagged behind advanced nations. The government will adopt a tenure plan to tackle such threats for the protection of citizens and space assets. It plans to develop technology to monitor and assess threats and develop the necessary infrastructure. In order to achieve its goals, the government also plans to strengthen cooperation with the U.S. and Europe in these fields and expand its R&D to foster exports. Paul Yi, Arirang News.
After years of on-again, off-again talks, the last U.S. soldier held prisoner in Afghanistan has been freed as part of a swap with the Taliban. Taliban militants in Afghanistan on Saturday handed over 28-year-old U.S. Army Sergeant Bo Bergdahl, a POW for almost 5 years since his capture on June 30, 2009. In exchange, the U.S. released 5 Afghan Taliban prisoners from the Guantanamo Bay prison, all of whom were high-ranking members of the Taliban government toppled by the U.S. in 2001. While some experts are optimistic that the exchange means there is a growing momentum within the Taliban for political talks, some members of the U.S. Congress have criticized the move, saying that U.S. adversaries now have a strong incentive to capture Americans. Now the weather for Koreans who have just finished packing their spring clothes. It was a sizzling hot weekend. Things are about to cool down in Seoul with the mercury hovering just above 22 in Monday morning. Rain and strong currents are expected to hinder efforts in Jindo near the tragic Tohol sinking site. Here's the weather around the world now. And that's all we could squeeze into this newscast. Thank you for watching. Have a great start to your week.